You're listening to the Story By podcast. This show features short fiction with two things in common. First, I wanted to share them. Second, the rights to option or produce them for other media are available. My name is Lewayne L. White. I'll be the host and narrator. Welcome to the Story By podcast. I'm glad you decided to drop by. Since this is the first episode, I thought I'd give you a quick origin story before we get started. I'm a writer, both of prose fiction and screenplays, and I was also interested in podcasting, so I combined these things to create this show. The title comes from a screenwriting credit called Story By, which indicates the credited person created the plot and or characters for a screenplay, perhaps even a short summary called a treatment, but may not have written the screenplay itself. In this case, these are stories by, well, me mostly, as well as some occasional guest authors. And like the opening said, these stories are all available for adaptation into other media. If you're interested in acquiring the rights to turn a piece from one of these episodes into a screenplay, stage play, radio show, or something else entirely, simply contact us at storybypodcast, all one word, at gmail.com. We'll do more housekeeping at the end of the show, so for now, why don't we get into Payback, a story about a young soldier whose small act of mercy in the middle of a war is repaid in a way he never expected. Payback by Lewayne L. White. Private Gerald R. Green Jr.'s heart pounded like the In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida drum solo. Bullets zipped past his head and chopped down greenery and soldiers with equal disinterest. Green crouched with a couple guys behind a small ridge and prayed he wasn't going to die today. Blood decorated Green's sleeve as PFC Morton crumpled beside him, a gaping hole in the breast pocket that held a wrinkled picture of his wife and son. Johnson, the skinny black kid from Detroit, looked down at the wheezing Morton, said, "Jesus Christ!" then flipped sideways. Johnson lay face down in the muck and water, staining the pool with blood as red and real as Morton's. Green didn't move, didn't reach down to see if his friends were alive. He knew they weren't, and he didn't want to join them. It wasn't Green's war. It wasn't his country, his politics. He was just a farm kid from Iowa who was supposed to graduate from high school, marry his best girl, have some kids, and run the farm when his dad passed. He wasn't supposed to be hiding behind a clump of mud and leaves, bathed in his friend's blood, sweating, crying in some jungle. A jungle, damn it, with rice paddies and giant biting bugs. Not a decent cornstalk in sight. Morton stopped gasping, and in the silence between rifle bursts, Green realized he was the only one left alive behind the Swiss-cheesed ridge. Green looked to his left and saw more of the patrol crouched behind another ridge, popping up like jack-in-the-boxes to spray the surrounding foliage with full-auto rifle fire and hate. Shell casings fell like rain, and Henderson's Heavy 60 provided the thunder. Green watched the guys perform their martial ballet. Shoot, drop the clip, reload, pull the charging handle, shoot, repeat. As far as Green knew, he'd never killed anyone in his life. He'd shot a few deer and hit one with a pickup, killed a few pheasants and shot a rabid dog, but never a person. Maxim raised a fist in the air, screamed, "I got one! I got me a gook!" People, Green's mother said in his head. Not gooks, not slants, not slopes. She had pointed at her own dark almond eyes and said, "Are these gook eyes?" She poked at his eyes like Mo going after Curly. His own eyes were as dark as hers, but as round as his father's. "Those gook eyes?" Green had shrugged, hung his head, muttered, "No." He hadn't added, "But you're Filipino, not a VC commie." Gerald R. Green Sr. had brought 2 prizes home from his tour of the Pacific during World War II. One had been a genuine kamikaze coffee can sword. The other had been Gerald's mother, Sarah's, already pregnant, with Gerald's oldest sister, Peg. Something heavy slammed into Green's head, throwing him to the ground. He fell hard into mud, brown water, and pieces of Mickey Cameron. Green figured he was dead and wondered why it hurt so damn bad. His ears were ringing, and when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but darkness. "Christ!" he yelled. "I've gone blind!" He staggered to his knees, grabbed at his eyes. Those gook eyes? And found his helmet had been shoved forward, covering them. With a cry of delight, Green threw the helmet from his head. It landed with a wet sound, and he saw the black and polished spot where a bullet had clipped it. Green felt around his head, found some blood, but no huge gaping hole. He screamed again and thrust a fist into the air. The tree in front of him exploded, and Green hit the deck, scrambling to collect his helmet and rifle. "Close! Too damn close!" he muttered, situating his dented helmet on his head. "Gotta get out! Gotta get out!" Green glanced toward the surviving members of the patrol, saw there were a few less, and decided to run. He stumbled to his feet, slid in wetness that he didn't want to identify, and blundered away from his friends. The sounds of gunfire followed him, punctuated by screams from the squad. Less than 20 yards away, another sound reached his ears. "Boy, what do you think you're doing?" Green froze, head hanging, as if the leather-skinned giant he'd called father, or at times like this, sir, stood behind him. "I didn't raise you yellow, did I?" Green shook his head. "I didn't raise you to turn your back, let your buddies take the rap, did I?" Green shook his head again. He recalled his father's war stories, tales of valor fit for pulps or comics. Green figured maybe half were true, and most of the true stories had happened to someone else. But he got the point. He wasn't in this war to protect the world from domino communism. He was there to get some war stories to impress his old man. Green turned around and hustled back to his position, figuring death would be preferable to the wrath of a father's dreams betrayed. When he rounded a tree, he saw a pajama-clad shape with a Chinese machine gun pointed at one of his guys. In 1 second, Green realized the soon-to-be-dead soldier was the big galumphing kid from Maine. In the next second, his M16 had fit against his shoulder like it had grown there. In the third second, Green squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of hot metal at the enemy soldier, and blasted a tree trunk next to the VC gunman. With a shriek, the man spun, hand clutching at his face. Green corrected, finger tightening on the trigger, but the gunman had turned and run. Green moved forward, rifle up. "Stevie, you cool?" "Hey, Stevie replied, pushing his GI-issue birth control glasses back onto his face. "I'm alive, anyway." Green rushed past him, yelled, "Check on the rest of the guys!" and headed off into the bush. "What the hell are you doing?" Green said to himself. "Let him go. Collect the guys. Get out." But he kept going. A splatter of blood on some leaves, a broken limb, a Firestone footprint in the muck. It was a trail a blind hound dog with no nose could follow. And Green followed, and literally stepped on his quarry. The kid, "Oh geez, he's really a kid," cried out as Green stumbled over him. Green tried to keep from falling, nearly succeeded, and landed hard in a jumble of gear and greenery. He swung around, came up on his knees. The kid had him cold. Green actually saw his finger tighten on the trigger. And nothing happened. The kid squeezed again. Again. "Jammed," Green said. "Empty. Doesn't matter." Green brought his rifle up, sighted out on target only a few feet away. The boy sagged, wiped at the blood on his face, and mumbled something in Vietnamese. Green looked at the kid. He was maybe 10 years old, a little younger than Green's sister, May. Tall for his age, he'd looked older. Several bleeding cuts decorated the side of the kid's face. At least 2 slivers of tree bark still protruded from the boy's cheek. "What are you doing?" Green roared at the boy. "Are you crazy?" The boy cringed, not understanding the words, but recognizing the tone. Green pointed his rifle at the kid, screamed, "You want to die?" The boy put up his hands, chattered in Vietnamese. Tears ran down his cheeks, mingling with the blood. And Green saw the kid's eyes. They were blue-green. "You a little half-blood, too?" Green shouted at the boy. "You here fighting your daddy's memory, too?" The kid, having no idea what Green was saying and too scared to speak even if he did, just crouched lower and cried harder. Green sighed, gestured with the rifle. "Get out of here!" The boy crouched, wailing, "Go! Get away!" When the boy didn't move, Green reached out, grabbed him by the shoulder. "Go!" he roared, shoving the kid. The boy stumbled, crying, cringing, howling. Green fired a burst into the mud near the boy's feet, and the kid finally got it. He ran. Green watched him disappear, then sighed, hoping to God he hadn't done something stupid by not killing somebody's son. He humped back to the squad, slung his rifle, and helped Henderson and Stevie gather up the pieces of their friends. Henderson radioed for extraction, then they dragged or carried everybody out to the LZ, popped smoke, and waited for their ride. Green's day ended watching the sun bleed over the jungle as he held Maxim's cooling hand and prayed the Huey would make it back to the firebase. 20 years later, Green, grayer, softer, and wearing khakis made by Docker instead of Uncle Sam, sat in an ambulance holding his son's hand and hoping the ambulance would make it to Mercy Hospital. The driver zigzagged around traffic like a NASCAR racer on a go-kart track. Occasionally his partner would exchange chatter with the ER, using words like head trauma and letters and numbers that didn't seem to go together. 2 minutes out! Green glanced at his watch and realized it had been nearly a half hour since the idiot in the supersized pickup had blown a red light and pulverized Green's Honda. Of course, Danny's side of the little hatchback took the brunt of the collision. 1 minute, Green and his son were on their way to see Platoon. Danny asking why Green never told war stories like the other dads. Sounding like maybe he suspected Green had never done anything heroic. The next moment, Green was squeezed against his door with a bleeding Danny in his lap. Stunned, recovering from blackout, Green had actually called out, "Medic!" Blinking away pain, he popped his door open and tumbled out into the street, cradling his son. Then a flurry of activity surrounded them. People screamed, bustled, got in each other's way. Green flailed his arms, fighting the crowd, trying to protect his wounded man. "Easy, soldier," said a lean black man. For a second, Green thought it was Johnson, the Motown motormouth whose head had exploded all over Green's fatigues. "I called for help," the man said, and it broke the spell. Johnson had a voice meant for the high part in doo-wop backup. This good Samaritan sounded like he ate the blues for breakfast, washed them down with whiskey, maybe had some cheap cigarettes for dessert. "Ambulance is coming for your boy," the guy said. "Be here in a few minutes." Now they were less than 2 minutes out, then 1. Then into the ER and more hyperkinetic activity. More numbers, letters. Danny disappeared into an OR and Green stood in the wake, unsure what to do. Danny's blood covered his hands and his shirt, and Green wiped at his face, knew he'd just given himself war paint, and didn't really care. He felt his knees going and leaned against the wall. "Mr. Green?" He turned to see a short blonde woman wearing turquoise scrubs. She held a clipboard and said, "I've got an update on your son." What followed was a blur of Latin, then the English translations, then a word Green recognized. "Specialist?" "Specialist," Green said, stopping her recitation. "Danny's that serious?" The blonde gave him a reassuring smile, and Green knew why she had this job. "Dr. H is the best, Mr. Green. He was at the hospital checking on another patient, so we paged him and he's ready to go. If you could just sign this?" Green nodded, scanned the consent form, and scribbled his name. "Dr. H will see you as soon as he's done, and he'll explain everything." "Okay." The blonde gave him another 1,000-watt smile. "Would you like to get cleaned up, Mr. Green?" Green looked down at himself, saw the blood, felt himself listing. The blonde put a hand to his shoulder, just enough to steady him, and said, "Why don't you come with me?" A short time later, Green sat in a waiting room chair, holding a cup of coffee, and watching a young Asian woman trying to comfort a gray and shriveled mama-san. He could tell from the chatter they weren't speaking Vietnamese. He'd heard enough of that language to identify it instantly. "Maybe Chinese?" Green sipped his coffee, looked down at the scrubs the blonde had found for him. Some sort of navy blue the custodial staff wore. A door opened with a bang, and a figure in surgical scrubs approached. Green and the woman both looked up, anticipating the worst. "Mr. Green?" the surgeon said. Green tossed his cup into a nearby wastebasket. He stood and said, "Dr. H?" And he froze. The man stood nearly as tall as Green, but he was probably 50 pounds lighter. He had bristly black hair and blue-green eyes, and several small, puckered scars around those eyes, where bits of tree bark had struck him nearly 20 years before. "Oh my God!" Green gasped. Dr. H raised his hand. "I assure you, it's good news, Mr. Green." "No," Green said. It can't be." The doctor paused, confused by Green's reaction. "Mr. Green, your son will be fine." Green collapsed to his knees. "Mr. Green!" Dr. H reached down to Green. "Mr. Green, are you all right?" Green blinked, said, You don't have an accent." Dr. H helped Green back to his feet and said, "Not much of one, no. Do I know you?" Green smiled, gestured toward his borrowed clothes, and said, "Last time you were in the dark PJs." He poked at the surgeon's spinach-colored scrubs. "And I was wearing green." Dr. H squinted at Green, which made his scars flicker like lightning. Then his eyes widened. "You?" Words Green hadn't used since he'd left Vietnam rolled automatically off his tongue. Dr. H smiled, replied in English, Greetings to you too, old friend. I can't tell you how glad I am I didn't kill you, Green said. Dr. H snorted. I can't tell you how glad I am you didn't kill me. Green wiped at his eyes. Danny's gonna be okay? Dr. H nodded. He'll recover. You can see him in a little while. Green nodded, then looked at the doctor's ID tag. Dr. Ho? The guy at immigration was pissed off I'd made it out of Vietnam, and his son didn't. Documented me as Ho Chi Minh, thinking he was funny. Seriously? Dr. Ho nodded. That's the name on my degree, my license, all of it. He shrugged, added, Seemed like a small price to pay to live in America. You have time for a cup of coffee, a beer, something? Green asked. I feel like I owe you. Dr. Ho shook his head. I owed you, Mr. Green. With that, he patted Green's shoulder and said, Go see your son. Green watched Dr. Ho walk away and knew he finally had a war story to share with Danny. Hey, thanks for listening today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you come back for our next episode. If you don't want to hear some additional comments about the story or listen to all the business stuff, you can check out here. But if you want to learn a little more about the show and where to find the all-important social media stuff, hang out just a little longer. Payback was a short story winner in the Des Moines Area Community College Creative Writing Contest back when I was a student there, and was originally published in Expressions, the literary magazine of the Des Moines Area Community College. I've had more than one person ask me if this is a true story, and I usually say it's inspired by a true event. Specifically, I was injured in a car accident when I was a teenager and required the services of a surgical specialist. His name was Dr. Ho, and when he and my father, a Vietnam veteran, first met, they paused and looked at each other a little strangely, like they had met each other before, then went on about their business. I basically made up all the rest years later. I chose this story as the podcast's first episode because it's about stories, the ones we tell, the ones we feel we have to live up to, and the new ones that we create every day. I hope you enjoyed Payback. If you did, I'd appreciate any comments at storybypodcast@gmail.com. For now, any updates, announcements about new episodes, show notes, and other information can be found at facebook.com/storybypodcast. If you're interested in reading Payback, it's available for Kindle. You can find it by searching Lewayne L. White on Amazon.com or following the link to it in the show notes. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll visit again.